As the crisis in Ukraine continues to intensify, so does the relentless war of words in and around the conflict. Vladimir Putin shocked many by saying Russia's invasion of Ukraine has only just begun. One thing is for sure, with heavy shelling pounding residential areas, it's civilians who are paying the deadly price. The Ukrainian side, meanwhile, says it's seeking to amass and arm 1 million troops. So, on to the point we ask, after capturing large parts of Donbas, will Putin have an appetite for more? A warm welcome to the Point with these guests today. Liana Fix is a political analyst focusing on Russia and Eastern Europe. Moritz Gathmann is chief reporter with the German magazine Cicero. And joining us from Bonn is my Ukrainian colleague Roman Goncharenko, who works with DW's Russian language service. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. Liana, I'd like to start with you. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is speaking of this massive counter-offensive to regain territories in the country's south. Is it plausible? Is it even possible for Ukraine to do that?
Well, Ukraine obviously needs at this point some kind of success. And at the moment, it would be easier to achieve these successes in the south, although it is still very difficult, than in the east, where Russia is basically throwing all its artillery on the Ukrainian forces and pushing forwards meter by meter or kilometer by kilometer. At the same time, it's also a tactical decision to announce this plan to prevent that Russia will focus on all troops in the east, but also to free some of the troops in the east and to give Russia the opportunity to move to the south and there to keep some forces focused in the south. But obviously, with regard to the weapons available to the Ukrainian army, we need much more Western support to Ukraine to make such an offensive in the south successful.
We'll get to the weapons in a minute. I'd like to get your opinion. Do you think that Ukraine can even do that with the current capacities that they have?
I think at the moment, Ukraine is not capable of recapturing Kherson region, for example, because it's one question to have 1 million people who are ready to go, and it's another question to equip them properly. I just have one example of a friend who joined the army several months ago. He's mainly equipped with stuff that friends donated to him. Friends bought this equipment, and of course, it's a big operation against Russians in the Kherson region who have fortified their positions over the last months. It's a difficult area to do an offensive operation. And yes, as you said, Ukraine needs more than just soldiers to recapture this area.
That's right. That's only one part. Before we ask Roman about what the possibilities are, I'd like to listen to what the Russian President Vladimir Putin had to say about that the war is just beginning. Let's listen in.
We hear that they want to defeat us on the battlefield. What can I say? Let them try. It's a tragedy for the Ukrainian people, but it looks like that's where it's heading. But everyone should know that we haven't even started anything in earnest yet.
So that we have Russian president saying that the war is just beginning. I'd like to have the reaction of Roman, who's joining us from Bonn. Who is the Russian president addressing here?
Well, of course, he's addressing Ukraine. He's addressing the West as Ukraine's main supporter for weapons. And, of course, he's also addressing his domestic public in Russia. So I think it is indeed a point where we can say this war is just at the beginning. So this will be a very long conflict, probably years ahead of us. And Russia is really holding back some reserves. It is using old Soviet weapons, sending troops from faraway regions, and keeping all those best equipped troops from Moscow or St. Petersburg. So where in the west of Russia, western part of Russia, they are participating in this war, but not on a large scale. So Russia is preparing for a war of attrition. We are seeing this war of attrition happening, and Ukraine needs much more weapons to be able to stand for a long time, to be able to try and recapture maybe some cities in the south. At the moment, I think Ukraine will be winning this at this moment if it can stop the Russian advance. So stopping Russians in the south, stopping them in the east in Donbas would be a victory for the moment for Ukraine, I think.
And just to add perhaps to that, at the same time, it's also a strategic communication operation, as was said, towards the West, to convey the impression, well, your support is futile. It doesn't make any sense because we can throw as much soldiers and as much materials into the war as we want, which is to some extent, of course, overblown because Russia had some very heavy casualties, 24,000 soldiers as estimated by the British side. So this is also a communication attempt and a propaganda attempt towards the West to play into war fatigue, to play into the energy crisis, into the inflation problems in Western countries.
Do you think it's working? The propaganda attempts to tell the West, this will be a long war, it makes no sense for you to support, to be unified with this solidarity towards Ukraine?
Well, as I look at the German society, for example, I have the feeling that it's working. Together with this inflation and energy crisis that we see in our country, because the people, for the first time now, they understand that the impact of the war is happening here. People will see over the next months the energy prices rising really a lot. And of course, people will pose the question to their government, is it worth, isn't it worth? Maybe we need a compromise with Russia. We heard these voices over the last 4 months, but they will be stronger even over the next months. And at this moment, Putin is sending the sign, we haven't started yet, we can do much more. Of course, I have the feeling that this can work, yeah.
Before we start talking about, you just mentioned energy prices, that's a really big topic, almost for another show. Let's focus on the situation on the ground, with many saying that the war has just started now in February, but the war has been going on for years and years. So the fighting in some areas of the Donbas since 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, pro-Russian separatists wanted the eastern Ukraine region to secede from the rest of Ukraine, and Russian troops gradually advance in the Donbas with deadly consequences for the civilians living there.
A man's body is recovered from the rubble of a multi-story apartment building. Neighbors looking on are shocked by the rescue work in Chasiv Yar in Donetsk Oblast. All that remains of the high-rise is a pile of rubble. During the night, Russian rockets hit the building, killing more than 40 residents. Only a few survivors could be rescued. Now we are always afraid at night and during the day, because we never know when something might happen to us. A Ukrainian soldier on home leave finds his grandmother's body under the rubble. I'm at a loss for words. Most of all, I would like to kill Putin. With seemingly unlimited supplies of artillery and ammunition, Russia's war machine appears to be slowly but fiercely moving forward. Meanwhile, Russia has conquered almost the entire Donbas region. What are Russia's plans for the occupied Donbas?
Really terrible situation for the civilians living there, and they're pounded by these Russian missiles. I'd like to pass the question on to you, Liana. What are Russia's plans for the occupied region?
Well, what we see right now is that Russia is pursuing a de facto annexation of these regions. We have politicians coming in, we have Russian structures installed in these regions, Ukrainian passports that are taken away and replaced by Russian passports. So that's a strategy that we already know from the past. But what is crucial here is, and I think it's really a rhetorical question to ask, if Vladimir Putin has the appetite for more war. He definitely has, because we really should not fall into this trap of thinking, well, he just wants the Donetsk and the Luhansk regions and then he'll be satisfied. This is not a question about, this is not a war about territory. This is a war about existence, about the existence of Ukraine as an independent nation. And Russia is already now beyond those territories, very active beyond those territories. It will continue to advance towards Odessa if it has the opportunity. So the question of, can we appease Russia if Ukraine somehow agrees to a ceasefire and to those regions remaining under Russian control is really not a serious question. This is not what Moscow is planning.
But for some, it is still a serious question, saying that we should talk to Russia, that they should be back again on the negotiation table. What do you think? There have been so many red lines by the West when it comes to Russia, and Putin says, I can continue as long as I want to go. How is it possible to stop him?
I think the only possibility is to show strength. This is the only thing, actually, that Putin understands. We have seen this over the last decade, where we had several attempts of talking to Putin. We had lots of politicians in the West who said, we have to find a compromise, we have to understand the Russians. But unfortunately, this didn't work. And those who haven't understood this on February 24th, maybe it's their problem. Putin only understands strength. And so on the one hand, we have to strengthen Ukraine, concerning the economy, concerning the military. On the other hand, we have to find solutions for our own economies. This concerns mainly gas, because we are very much reliant on Russian gas, and we have to redesign our energy system over the upcoming 2 years, not buying gas in other places after these 2 years, but somehow getting rid of gas. Because if we are just buying gas in other places, this will keep the gas prices on a high level, and this will be very useful to Putin.
So finding a long-term solution to the dependence of Russian gas. I'd like to ask Roman about the report that we just saw. What are Russia's plans, also considering that Russia wants now to have this fast procedure for Ukrainians to get a Russian passport? So what is the plan on a long term?
Well, I agree with what Liana has just said. So the plan is to destroy Ukraine as an independent state. And Russia is keeping on this path, and it is not going to fulfill this aim quickly. So Russia is trying to cut Ukraine in pieces, because it is just too big to destroy quickly. And that is why Russia has occupied some territories and is now trying to integrate them into Russia by changing the currency. So you pay not in Ukrainian but in Russian ruble. They are changing the school programs. They are sending Russian politicians, Russian military to control. And of course, they are trying to suppress the Ukrainian opposition in those territories, the Ukrainians who are willing to fight behind the front lines. So this will take some time, but I think that Russia is probably will continue to occupy much more territory by fall, maybe in winter. And the West is already doing a lot. And what we have seen so far, the West is also facing a dilemma. If they are providing Ukraine with more deadly weapons like those HIMARS rocket launchers, which are very effective, as we have seen in the last few days, against Russian ammunition depots and command posts, then the West is asking the question, where is the red line for Putin when he will hit back? And he threatened to hit the targets in he didn't specify, but he said we could hit targets that we haven't hit before, and he probably implied the Ukrainian government, maybe the Ukrainian defense ministry, so targets in the Ukrainian capital or maybe targets in other major cities, military targets, targets maybe of where Ukrainian command is. So it is very difficult for the West. On the one hand, they want to help, they want to supply more weapons, but they have to find a way not to cross a certain line, which is not seen, of course. Nobody knows where that line is, not to make this war much worse than it already is.
Roman, you mentioned the civil society and also the Ukrainian opposition in those occupied territories, and I would like to take a look at the people living there, the people living in these places, in these occupied cities that Ukraine wants to retake. And our Ukraine correspondent Nick Connolly spoke with two citizens in the southern city of Kherson. Due to security concerns, they wanted to stay anonymous, and this is what they had to say.
At the beginning, we all thought the occupation would be over in a week. It was only a few months in that we finally understood that the Russians were here to stay.
It looks all fine and tidy in town and peaceful, except for the military vehicles. But in fact, there are many places where the Russians do their dirty things, and of course you don't hear about that. Many people were kidnapped. I see also many posters on the streets and on Facebook telling that this or that person is missing.
When the Russians came, we were expecting things would be as bad as in Mariupol. We were scared to even look out the window. It was sheer panic. The fact that we can leave the house and buy food seems like a miracle.
I'd say everyone is sure that the Ukrainians will liberate. The question is how and when. And we got the idea that it should become a marathon rather than a sprint.
But how realistic is the Ukrainian army's planned reconquest of the south?
And as Russia wants to offer the Ukrainians a Russian passport, Ukraine is telling them to leave the area as quickly as possible. How can that work, Moritz?
I think there's a very important psychological problem, for example, in this region of Kherson at the moment, because the longer it takes for Ukraine to take back these regions, the more these people will get used to Russian occupation. Of course, Ukraine is telling them, don't collaborate with the Russians, we will come back. But of course, if you are a citizen of Kherson and you're waiting for months and years for the Ukrainians to come, you have to somehow live your life or leave the regions. So this is what we saw also in the Donbas region 8 years ago. The Ukrainians couldn't take these regions back. And of course, people, after some time, either they left the region or they stayed there and they somehow adapted to Russian occupation.
To a longer process, they know that this war will continue also for months, if not years. Liana, what will that make with the Western solidarity for Ukraine? We have G7 countries saying that they will support Ukraine as long as it takes. Do you think that there is a unity to support Ukraine, or that many countries are now saying this is really getting difficult for us as well?
I think we still have unity at the moment, but the closer winter comes, the more urgent the energy problems become, the louder will become calls that we need a ceasefire. And my concern is that at some point Moscow will play to these fears, as it does already now, and for instance propose some kind of toxic proposal about, well, once they've occupied perhaps the entirety of the region of Donetsk, to offer a ceasefire, which obviously would not be a credible ceasefire from the Russian side. We know from Russia's war strategy in Syria that they offer ceasefires just to take a break for their own forces and come back even stronger. But the temptation will be there in the West to say, well, perhaps we should try a ceasefire, and possibly to pressure Ukraine. Ukraine has learned its lesson from 2014. A ceasefire doesn't work. Russia will come back, and even worse than it has been in the past. But for the West, this will be a challenge if we see this kind of poisoned pill for Moscow.
Roman, Liana just said Ukraine learned its lesson from 2014. What about the West?
Well, we're still not sure that the lessons were properly learned, because Germany, when we speak about Germany, is still having a huge problem with Russian gas, something which Moritz was talking about. So the dependency is so immense. Over 50% of German gas comes from Russia, and we cannot solve this problem here in Germany fast enough. And Ukraine needs Germany actually to stop buying Russian gas, because every dollar, every euro that Germany pays for it goes then probably to Russian weapons, to the Russian army, and is then turned against Ukraine. So there are still lessons to be learned, and quickly. I would like just a few words, if I may, to the people living now in the occupied territories in the south or in the east. In the east, it's a different story, because much part of Donbas, or some part of it, was already occupied in 2014. But as to the south, it's a completely new situation, and nobody knows how Ukrainians living there, those millions of people, will react in a few months or in 1 year living under Russian occupation. I presume that as long as Russia is strong and can suppress Ukrainians living there and trying to oppose the new Russian regime, as long as Russia is strong, there will be probably no great changes there. But when Russia is weakened by Western sanctions, then I think an uprising is possible. But it is still too early to tell when this will happen and under which circumstances.
Roman just mentioned the sanctions, and we have all this discussion when it comes to Nord Stream 1. They have the annual maintenance. We have this turbine in Canada that will now be sent to Germany and then to Russia to activate this gas pipeline again. Do you think it's credible when the West says we have the sanctions for Russia, but when they start affecting us more, then we say, OK, they're not that important anymore?
Well, there's a reason why there are no sanctions on gas so far, and why there are oil sanctions which will only come into place at the end of the year. And that is exactly the dependency of the West on Russian gas. So the idea is, also when it comes to this turbine, it is to make clear that it is Russia which is cutting off the gas, and that Germany is not sort of, it's not the fault of the German government, and this is obviously domestic communication towards the German public, if gas supplies from Russia get further cut. It is a very reactive strategy. It is not a proactive strategy of trying to pressure Moscow, for instance, through caps on gas prices. But it is a strategy to fill the storages and to try to outplay Moscow. And I'm not sure who will have the upper hand in this game.
I wanted to add that maybe the story with the turbine, it was also done in this way to not give Moscow an extra argument in its propaganda that this is why we don't supply gas to Germany anymore or to Europe. I want to add one more thing to this gas question. We see in Germany how difficult the situation is concerning the gas prices. But of course, Germany is a strong country economically, financially. We must also look at other countries in the European Union, especially in the East, countries like Bulgaria, who are even more dependent on Russian gas and who are economically much more weak. How will they come through this crisis? Germany can pay extra money to its citizens, to those groups of the population who isn't that rich. But what will Bulgaria do? This is a very difficult question, and the European Union should address this question now.
We only have a few minutes left. I would like to, if we go back to the question at the beginning, does Putin have more appetite for war? I think we all agree that he has, that he will continue. How can this be stopped? What should be the signal that the West should send now to say, this is enough?
I think the West needs to get into a strategic planning when it comes to weapon deliveries, and to link weapon deliveries to a clear war aim, which should be ideally on the greater scale the pushing back Russia to the pre-invasion lines. But if there are smaller aims, for instance, retaking Kherson, the weapon delivery should be calibrated towards these aims rather than coming ad hoc once the West has those available. So we need a strategic planning. What does Ukraine need in 3 months, in 6 months? Also, because domestic industries and military industries, weapon industries need to adapt to produce these amounts of munition and of weapons.
How do you see it, Roman? How can this hunger for more that Putin has be stopped now? What are the signals that the West should send?
Well, the signals should be that the West is ready to take pain to help Ukraine. I mean, of course, by showing that it is ready to get rid of Russian gas supplies as soon as possible, and probably sooner than we think now at this moment. This is most important, I think, and it should also continue to supply Ukraine with weapons, because this is the only thing that Putin understands: strength, and strength means weapons and weapons and once again weapons.
You mentioned the strength already. Is there a sign, something where you say the West really needs to do that now, quickly?
I think the West should not only supply Ukraine with weapons, but it should also train Ukrainian soldiers in the West. And this is something that is actually happening at the moment already. And this is a good sign, because it means that the West has a strategy not only for weeks, but for months.
A good sign. Thank you so much, Moritz, Liana, Roman, also, and all of you for watching this show To The Point. If you have any comments, you can leave it on our email or a comment on YouTube. Thank you so much.